Tonight, we look at aviation's deadliest runway disasters. From crowded airports shrouded in fog to tragic collisions in broad daylight, the runway has often been the stage for some of aviation's darkest moments. These stories are not just about loss, but about the lessons learned and the changes that reshaped flight safety forever. If you find these documentaries meaningful, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more untold stories of aviation history. On March 27, 1997, the island of Tenerife in Spain's Canary Islands became the setting for the deadliest accident in aviation history. What happened that day was not a single mistake, but a chain of misfortune, confusion, and human error that claimed the lives of 583 people and changed the way aviation operates forever. It began not with Tenerife itself, but with a bomb. That morning, a terrorist explosion at Gran Canaria Airport forced dozens of incoming flights to be diverted to Los Rodeos Airport, a smaller facility on the neighboring island of Tenerife. Los Rodeos was never designed to handle such traffic. It had only a single runway, a narrow parallel taxiway, and limited parking space. Soon, the small airport became overcrowded, with wide-body jets parked shoulder to shoulder along the taxiways. Among those diverted were two giants of the skies, KLM Flight 480-5, a Boeing 747, carrying Dutch holidaymakers bound for Las Palmas, and Pan Am Flight 1736, another Boeing 747, carrying American tourists. Both crews expected to wait only a few hours before resuming their journeys. But as the day wore on, delays stacked up, tempers grew short, and weather conditions deteriorated. By the afternoon, a thick blanket of fog rolled across the runway. Visibility dropped to just a few hundred feet. Controllers in the tower could no longer see the aircraft with their own eyes. Instead, they relied solely on radio communication. This would prove catastrophic. The Pan Am 747 was instructed to taxi down the runway and exit at the third taxiway. The KLM aircraft, heavier and carrying more fuel, had taxied to the end of the runway and was preparing for takeoff. But the fog created confusion. The Pan Am crew struggled to find the correct exit in the low visibility, while the KLM crew was eager to depart, as their duty time was running out. Captain Jacob van Zanten of KLM was one of the airline's most respected pilots. He was also the face of KLM's advertisements, a man who symbolized safety and professionalism. Yet on this day, under pressure from delays and looming duty limits, he made a fateful decision. Believing he had been cleared for takeoff, he advanced the throttles and began accelerating down the runway. In reality, the controller had not given full clearance. The tower had only issued instructions to stand by after reading back a clearance that was not yet final. In the dense fog, the KLM crew could not see that the Pan Am jumbo jet was still taxiing directly ahead of them. As the KLM roared down the runway, the Pan Am crew suddenly realized the danger. Captain Victor Grubbs of Pan Am shouted, "There he is! God damn, that son of a bitch is coming!" They pushed the throttles forward, desperately trying to exit the runway, but it was too late. The massive KLM 747 lifted slightly into the air, its nose just clear of the Pan Am aircraft. Its undercarriage and engines, however, struck the upper fuselage of the Pan Am jet with incredible force. A fireball erupted as jet fuel ignited. The Pan Am 747 was torn apart, engulfed in flames, killing most of its passengers instantly. The KLM aircraft, badly damaged, lifted briefly into the air before crashing back onto the runway, exploding into a firestorm that consumed all 248 people on board. On the ground, rescue crews rushed to the scene, but faced unimaginable horror. Bodies, wreckage, and flames covered the single runway. Survivors from the Pan Am aircraft, dazed and injured, stumbled away through the smoke, some jumping from the broken fuselage onto the tarmac. In the end, 61 people from the Pan Am jet survived, but none from the KLM. The investigation revealed how a chain of factors had lined up with deadly precision. A terrorist bomb in Gran Canaria, overcrowding at Los Rodeos, worsening fog, vague radio communications, and the psychology of a respected captain under pressure. The phrase, "We are now at takeoff," from the KLM cockpit, became infamous as the moment miscommunication sealed the fate of hundreds. From this tragedy, aviation changed forever. The importance of standardized radio phraseology became paramount. Ambiguous words like "okay" and "stand by" were banned from critical communications. Crew resource management, known as CRM, was born, ensuring that co-pilots could challenge captains when safety was at risk. Runway safety procedures were rewritten, and international aviation recognized that human factors could be just as dangerous as technical failures. Today, the Tenerife disaster remains the single deadliest accident in aviation history. Its lessons echo through every cockpit, every control tower, and every flight that takes off and lands safely. It is a story of tragedy, but also of progress bought at the highest price. On the morning of October 8, 2001, Milan's Linate Airport was shrouded in thick autumn fog. Visibility dropped to less than 200 meters, and controllers relied heavily on voice communication to guide aircraft moving across the taxiways and runways. It was a normal busy day, but within minutes, the fog would conceal one of Europe's deadliest runway tragedies. That morning, a small Cessna Citation CJ-2 business jet prepared to depart for Paris. At the same time, Scandinavian Airlines Flight 110, an MD-87, bound for Copenhagen, was lining up for takeoff, with 104 passengers and crew on board. The Cessna was instructed to taxi toward the runway, but in the fog, with poor signage and outdated ground radar, the pilots became disoriented. Instead of stopping short of the active runway, they continued straight ahead, unknowingly entering the path of the accelerating SAS jet. At exactly 8:10 a.m., the MD-87 began its takeoff roll. Hidden by the dense fog, the crew could not see that a smaller aircraft sat directly in their path. In a fraction of a second, the jet struck the Cessna at full speed. The smaller aircraft disintegrated instantly, killing all four on board. The MD-87, badly damaged, tried to lift off but lost control. It veered off the runway and crashed into a baggage handling building. Inside, ground workers had no chance to escape. In total, 118 people lost their lives. It was Italy's worst aviation disaster, and it revealed serious shortcomings in airport infrastructure. Investigators discovered that Linate's taxiway signs were faded and confusing. Ground radar was outdated and nearly useless in heavy fog, and communication between controllers and pilots lacked precision. The Cessna crew, unfamiliar with the complex layout, had received unclear instructions. The SAS pilots, accelerating into the fog, had no visual chance to avoid the collision. It was a catastrophe born not of a single mistake, but of an environment where small errors combined into fatal consequences. The aftermath of the disaster brought sweeping changes to European airports. Ground radar was upgraded across the continent. Clearer taxiway markings and illuminated signage became mandatory. Radio communication protocols were tightened to reduce ambiguity. Linate itself underwent massive renovations, and the lessons learned in Milan echoed worldwide. The tragedy of October 2001 remains etched into memory, not only for its scale, but also for its cruel timing. Barely 1 month after the attacks of September 11, when aviation safety was already under the world's microscope, Milan's fog revealed how vulnerable even the most ordinary flight could be. For the families of the victims, the pain never truly faded. But for aviation, their loss became a turning point that made airports safer for everyone who steps onto a plane today. For most of the world, the name Los Rodeos Airport will forever be linked with the disaster of 1977 the deadliest accident in aviation history. But what is often forgotten is that the tragedy did not mark the end of danger at this small airport on the island of Tenerife. Instead, throughout the 1980s, Los Rodeos gained a reputation as one of Europe's most hazardous airfields, a place where weather, terrain, and outdated infrastructure continued to put lives at risk. Los Rodeos sits high in the north of the island, at an elevation of 2,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by rugged hills and open to the Atlantic's ever-changing weather. Unlike the modern airports with long, wide runways and advanced ground radar, Los Rodeos had only a single runway, limited taxiways, and very few technological aids. Its biggest enemy, however, was the weather. Almost daily, fog rolled in from the ocean, creeping over the runway and blanketing the airport in a thick, shifting wall of white. For pilots approaching from the sea, one moment the runway was visible, the next it had vanished entirely. In the 1980s, technology to deal with this was primitive. Controllers often relied on eyesight rather than reliable radar, and aircraft landing or taxiing sometimes disappeared into the mist for minutes at a time. Several incidents made headlines during this period, each one reminding the world that Tenerife's deadliest day in 1977 was not an isolated event. In 1983, a Boeing 737 arriving from mainland Spain veered dangerously off the runway during landing, skidding into the soft ground. Fortunately, no lives were lost, but photographs of the stranded jet in the fog were haunting echoes of the past. Only 2 years later, in 1985, another passenger jet suffered a runway excursion in near-zero visibility. The aircraft stopped just short of the perimeter fence, its fuselage tilted awkwardly in the grass. Passengers evacuated in panic, many recalling the Tenerife disaster and fearing history was about to repeat itself. These incidents were not as deadly as 1977, but they cemented Los Rodeos' reputation as a cursed place for aviation. Pilots openly discussed their fears when assigned to land there. Airline safety departments issued special notices, instructing crews to approach with caution, to double-check taxiway clearances, and to expect sudden weather changes. Part of the danger lay not only in the fog, but in the airport's design. Taxiways were poorly marked, and in low visibility, aircraft could easily miss a turn and end up back on the runway by mistake. Ground radar, standard in many major airports by the 1980s, was still absent. Controllers often had no idea where an aircraft was once it vanished into the mist. It was almost as if every takeoff and landing at Los Rodeos carried with it a roll of the dice. The Spanish government came under pressure to improve safety. Local residents, still haunted by the memory of 583 lives lost, demanded that authorities act. Yet progress was slow. Limited resources and Tenerife's reliance on tourism kept the airport operating, even as it struggled with its dark reputation. By the late 1980s, the solution became clear. Tenerife needed a new airport in a safer location. In the south of the island, where weather was more predictable and fog less frequent, construction began on what would become Tenerife South Airport. Gradually, more and more international flights were diverted there, leaving Los Rodeos primarily for regional traffic. Still, the legacy of the 1980s incidents remains. Every skid, every near miss, every terrified passenger stepping off a plane in the fog was another reminder of the fragility of flight. And for aviation as a whole, Los Rodeos became a case study in how geography and weather can conspire to make even the most ordinary airport one of the most dangerous in the world. Today, Los Rodeos, now officially Tenerife North, remains in operation, but with upgraded systems, better radar, and stricter safety protocols. Yet the ghosts of the past linger in the fog, a reminder that for nearly 2 decades after the worst disaster in aviation, danger still lurked on the same runway. It was the morning of December 3rd, 1990, at Detroit Metropolitan Wayne County Airport. Snow was falling, visibility was poor, and the airport's runways and taxiways were slick with ice. Like many winter days in the Midwest, conditions made flying more challenging than usual. Yet no one could have predicted that two aircraft from the same airline would collide on the ground in one of the most haunting runway accidents in American history. Northwest Airlines Flight 1482 was a DC-9 preparing to depart for Pittsburgh. On board were 40 passengers and a crew of 4. The aircraft taxied out into the snowy haze, its pilots relying heavily on ground control instructions. At the same time, Northwest Airlines Flight 299, a Boeing 727, bound for Memphis, was cleared for takeoff on runway 3 left. The confusion began when the DC-9 crew of Flight 1482 missed a crucial taxiway turn. Snow and poor signage made the airport layout difficult to navigate, and ground control instructions, spoken quickly over the radio, were not clearly understood. Believing they were on the correct taxi route, the DC-9 pilots inadvertently steered onto the active runway, right into the path of the accelerating Boeing 727. At approximately 1:45 p.m, the 727 thundered down the runway at takeoff speed. Through the blowing snow, its pilots suddenly saw a dark shape ahead, the DC-9, sitting squarely across their path. They had no time to avoid it. The massive jet plowed directly into the smaller aircraft, its wing cutting through the fuselage of the DC-9. The impact was devastating. The DC-9 burst into flames almost instantly. Inside the cabin, passengers were thrown from their seats as smoke and fire filled the aircraft. 8 people, including the captain and several passengers, lost their lives. Dozens of others scrambled desperately to escape through emergency exits as rescuers rushed onto the icy tarmac. The Boeing 727, though badly damaged, managed to stop safely on the runway. Its passengers, shaken and terrified, evacuated quickly. Miraculously, everyone aboard Flight 299 survived. For those on the DC-9, however, survival depended on seat location and sheer luck. Those sitting toward the rear had little chance, as fire consumed the fuselage within minutes. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board quickly uncovered the tragic chain of errors. The DC-9 had been cleared to taxi, but had misunderstood instructions. The snow-covered signage at Detroit Metro made it difficult to identify taxiway intersections. Ground controllers, overloaded with traffic in poor weather, failed to notice that the DC-9 had turned incorrectly and entered the active runway. Communication protocols were vague, and the lack of ground radar left controllers essentially blind once the plane disappeared into the snowy mist. The accident revealed systemic problems, not just individual mistakes. Airports across the United States often relied on visual observation, even in conditions where visibility was near zero. Controllers gave rapid-fire instructions without requiring precise readbacks from pilots. And pilots, especially at busy hubs, were often reluctant to question ATC out of fear of delaying traffic. The aftermath of the Detroit collision led to renewed emphasis on runway incursion prevention. Ground radar technology was accelerated, signage and lighting on taxiways were improved, and stricter phraseology rules were introduced. Pilots were reminded of their right and duty to ask for clarification when instructions seemed unclear. For the families of the 8 victims, these changes came at a terrible cost. The Detroit runway collision was a stark reminder that even on the ground, in the moments before a plane leaves the earth, danger can strike with catastrophic speed. Snow, fog, and human error combined that day to turn an ordinary winter departure into a tragedy etched into aviation history. On the morning of April 23, 1994, the city of Matsuyama, on Japan's Shikoku Island, was quiet. Its airport, a modest regional hub, rarely saw wide-body jets. But that day, a China Eastern Airlines MD-87, one of the largest aircraft to operate the route, prepared for landing. The flight had originated in Shanghai, carrying business travelers, tourists, and local residents returning home. The McDonnell Douglas MD-11 was a relatively new aircraft in the early 1990s. It was larger and more advanced than the DC-10 from which it was derived. Airlines around the world were eager to use it on international routes. But the MD-11 also carried a reputation. Its landing and handling characteristics were demanding, requiring precision from pilots, especially on shorter runways. Matsuyama's runway, at just over 6,000 feet, was considered short for such a large jet, particularly if conditions were not perfect. As the China Eastern crew approached Matsuyama that morning, the weather appeared normal at first. Winds were light, visibility was acceptable, but the runway surface was damp from earlier rainfall. A wet runway meant braking action could be reduced, and every foot of asphalt would matter. The MD-11 lined up for final approach. In the cockpit, the crew ran through their landing checklist. Speed was slightly higher than optimal, a common problem for the MD-11, which tended to float on approach if not handled with precision. At touchdown, every knot of extra speed would translate into hundreds of extra feet, traveled before the aircraft could be brought under control. At approximately 10 a.m., the jet touched down, but instead of landing firmly near the designated touchdown zone, the aircraft floated further down the runway. Witnesses later reported that the wheels did not make full contact until nearly halfway along the 6,000-foot strip. Immediately, the crew applied maximum braking and deployed thrust reversers, but physics was against them. The MD-11's heavy weight, the damp surface, and the late touchdown combined to leave too little distance for the aircraft to stop. Passengers felt the engines roar in reverse thrust, the brakes vibrating under maximum pressure. Yet the jet continued its unstoppable slide toward the runway's end. Seconds later, the inevitable happened. The wide-body aircraft overran the runway, plowing through the safety area and coming to rest in a grassy field just beyond the perimeter. The nose gear collapsed, and the fuselage tilted forward at an alarming angle. Panic broke out inside the cabin as smoke and dust filled the air. Flight attendants shouted commands, struggling to keep passengers calm. Emergency slides deployed, and people tumbled down into the wet grass, some barefoot, others clutching bags, all shaken by the near disaster. Miraculously, all 213 passengers and crew survived. Injuries were mostly minor sprains, bruises, and cuts from the frantic evacuation. But for those on board, the psychological impact was immense. Many recalled the deafening noise of the engines, the smell of burning rubber, and the horrifying realization that the aircraft simply would not stop. Investigators quickly turned their attention to the circumstances. They found no evidence of mechanical failure. Instead, the cause was traced to human and operational factors. The crew had approached too fast, floated during landing, and failed to initiate a go-around when the touchdown zone was missed. In aviation, the rule is clear. If a landing is unstable, go around and try again. The China Eastern crew, however, pressed ahead, perhaps feeling pressure to complete the landing rather than risk delays. The accident also highlighted broader concerns about the MD-11. The aircraft's landing profile was notoriously difficult, with many airlines reporting hard landings, runway excursions, and pilot workload issues. Matsuyama's short runway simply magnified these challenges. In response, Japanese authorities issued new restrictions on the types of aircraft allowed to operate into airports with shorter runways. China Eastern retrained its crews, emphasizing go-around procedures and stabilized approaches. Globally, the Matsuyama incident became another data point in the MD-11's controversial service history, which would later include more fatal accidents linked to handling issues. For Matsuyama Airport, the event was a wake-up call. Runway safety areas were expanded, overrun protections were improved, and new approach procedures were put in place. Passengers in Japan were reminded that even in an advanced aviation nation, smaller airports faced unique risks when hosting wide-body aircraft. Though it ended without fatalities, the Matsuyama overrun is remembered as a close call that could have been far worse. For those who stepped off the slides that morning, the sight of a massive jet resting broken in a field beside a small regional airport was an image they would never forget. And for aviation as a whole, it was yet another reminder that precision, training, and respect for limitations are non-negotiable when 100 tons of aircraft hurtle toward the ground. On the evening of September 23, 1999, passengers aboard Qantas Flight 1, a Boeing 747-400, were preparing for landing at Bangkok's Don Mueang International Airport. The jumbo jet had departed from Sydney, carrying over 400 passengers and crew, many of them families on holiday or business travelers heading to Europe via Bangkok. For Qantas, an airline with one of the world's strongest safety records, the flight was meant to be routine. But what unfolded that night nearly became one of aviation's worst tragedies. Weather conditions in Bangkok were challenging. Heavy monsoon rains pounded the city, and the runway was slick with water. For pilots, wet conditions meant the risk of hydroplaning and reduced braking action. Still, the 747 crew felt confident. The Boeing 747-400 was a powerful aircraft, equipped with advanced systems, and the flight was on schedule. As Flight 1 approached the Thai capital, air traffic controllers cleared it to land on runway 21 left. Inside the cockpit, the crew discussed the conditions. Rain, wet surface, but manageable. The approach itself was stable, and at 10:45 p.m., the aircraft touched down. What happened next, however, would terrify everyone on board. Instead of firmly braking and deploying full reverse thrust, the landing roll became complicated. The crew, attempting to use a combination of manual braking and spoilers, delayed applying maximum braking power. The wet runway quickly reduced the effectiveness of their actions. The massive jet continued to roll, its speed barely decreasing. Seconds ticked by as the aircraft surged forward, the end of the runway approaching with frightening speed. Passengers later recalled how the roar of the engines filled the cabin, then turned into shouts from crew members telling people to brace. Some had no idea anything was wrong, until they looked out the windows and saw nothing but lights racing past. Then came the jolt. At more than 100 kilometers per hour, Qantas Flight 1 ran off the end of the runway. The giant aircraft plowed across wet grass, shearing through perimeter lights, before slamming into a small embankment. Mud and debris flew into the air as the jet's nose gear collapsed. For a moment, the cabin went dark. Oxygen masks dropped. Screams echoed through the aisles. Miraculously, the Boeing 747 came to rest intact. There was no explosion, no fireball, no loss of life. Panic spread, but flight attendants quickly initiated an evacuation. In the driving rain, hundreds of passengers slid down emergency slides onto the muddy field, dazed and drenched but alive. The aftermath revealed just how close the incident had come to catastrophe. The embankment at the runway's end had prevented the aircraft from sliding into a nearby canal, where the jet could have broken apart. For investigators, the question was simple. How had Qantas Flight 1, operated by one of the world's most respected airlines, nearly ended in disaster? The official inquiry found multiple factors. The crew had misjudged the wet runway conditions, underestimating the braking distance required. There was also confusion about whether to execute a go-around. In hindsight, a missed approach would have been the safest choice. Instead, the pilots attempted to continue with the landing, only to find themselves with too little runway left to stop. Critics pointed to decision-making under pressure as a central theme. Qantas crews were well trained, but human psychology played a role. Landing seemed easier than climbing back into turbulent storm clouds for another attempt. That hesitation, lasting only seconds, was the difference between safety and disaster. For Qantas, the incident was a shock. The airline had built a reputation for near-perfect safety, a brand so strong it was even referenced in pop culture. The Bangkok overrun cracked that image, reminding everyone that no airline, no matter how prestigious, was immune from mistakes. In the years that followed, Qantas and regulators worldwide introduced stricter protocols for landing in adverse conditions. Training emphasized the importance of go-arounds, even in large aircraft where missed approaches are costly and disruptive. Runway end safety areas were also expanded, designed to minimize damage if an aircraft ran long. Passengers from Flight 1 often described the surreal feeling of walking away from the wrecked jumbo jet in the rain. Many carried mud-stained shoes as souvenirs of survival. To this day, the incident is remembered not as a tragedy, but as one of the narrowest escapes in modern aviation, a reminder that even in the safest airlines, vigilance and decisive action remain vital. On August 20th, 2008, the passengers of Spanair Flight 502 boarded a McDonnell Douglas MD-82 at Madrid's Barajas Airport. It was a hot summer afternoon in the Spanish capital. Families, business travelers, and holidaymakers filled the aircraft, many bound for the Canary Islands for vacations in the Sunday. For most, it was just another short domestic flight. Within minutes, however, it would become one of Spain's worst aviation disasters. The aircraft, registered as EC-HFP, was operated by Spanair, a struggling airline facing financial pressure. Its MD-82, an aircraft designed in the 1970s, was still in service across Europe, though by then, its systems were considered outdated compared to newer airliners. That day, the crew was scheduled to fly to Gran Canaria. The flight was routine on paper, but hidden beneath the surface, small errors and technical oversights were lining up toward catastrophe. At 1:14 p.m., Flight 502 attempted its first takeoff, but during the initial roll, the pilots noticed abnormal readings. Sensors indicated an overheating air temperature probe, a technical fault requiring attention. The crew taxied back to the gate, where ground engineers examined the problem. After a brief delay, the issue was logged but not fully resolved. The system was deactivated as non-essential. With the pressure of schedules and hot summer conditions, the crew prepared for a second attempt. What neither the pilots nor the engineers realized was that during the hurried turnaround, a critical step had been missed. The aircraft's flaps and slats, the movable surfaces on the wings that provide extra lift during takeoff, had not been extended. In modern aircraft, warning systems would scream if such a condition existed, but the MD-82's takeoff warning system failed to sound an alarm, likely because of the earlier technical deactivation. At 2:24 p.m., Spanair Flight 5022 lined up again on runway 36 left. The sun shimmered off the tarmac, heat radiating into the cockpit. Passengers settled into their seats, unaware that their aircraft was not properly configured for flight. The takeoff roll began. Engines roared, and the jet accelerated down the runway. For a few moments, everything felt normal. But as the aircraft rotated and the nose lifted, the absence of extended flaps and slats became critical. Without the additional lift, the MD-82 struggled to climb. Within seconds, the aircraft stalled. Its left wing dropped sharply, dragging the jet off balance. Witnesses on the ground later described a horrifying sight. The plane rising only a few feet into the air, wobbling, and then crashing violently back onto the runway. The MD-82 slid across the tarmac, veered off course, and smashed into a field near the airport perimeter. A massive fireball erupted as fuel tanks ruptured. Black smoke rose into the sky, visible across Madrid. Rescue crews raced to the scene, but the devastation was overwhelming. Out of the 172 people on board, 154 lost their lives. Only 18 survived, many with severe burns and injuries. The investigation by Spanish authorities and international experts revealed a tragic chain of failures. The immediate cause was clear. The aircraft had attempted takeoff without flaps and slats extended. But the deeper question was why the takeoff warning system had not alerted the crew. investigators discovered that a maintenance fault, combined with the earlier technical issue, had disabled the system. Human factors compounded the problem. The crew, distracted by the earlier delay, had failed to complete the full checklist correctly. The findings shocked the public. How could such a basic error occur in the 21st century at a major European airport? The answer lay in a combination of old aircraft design, inadequate safety culture, and human error. The MD-82, a product of the 1970s, lacked the redundancy and modern protections of newer jets. Spanair, under financial strain, faced criticism for cutting corners, and the crew, operating under stress and high temperatures, made a fatal oversight. The tragedy of Flight 5022. Spain in mourning. Families of the victims demanded accountability. In the years that followed, lawsuits and public inquiries questioned not only Spanair, but also regulatory authorities. The disaster accelerated the retirement of older MD-80 series aircraft and forced airlines to tighten safety checks and reinforce checklist discipline. For survivors, the memories of that day were etched into their lives. Some recalled the unbearable heat and smoke, the struggle to crawl through wreckage, and the disbelief that such a mistake could have cost so many lives. For aviation, it was a sobering reminder that even in the modern era, the smallest lapse, a missed checklist item, a failed alarm, can trigger catastrophic consequences. On the night of March 29, 2015, Air Canada Flight 834 prepared for landing at Halifax Stanfield International Airport. The Airbus A320 had departed from Toronto with 133 passengers and 5 crew members on board. For most travellers, it was just another short domestic hop across Canada, a routine Sunday night flight that would bring them home before midnight. But the weather in Halifax that night was far from routine. A powerful winter storm had swept across Nova Scotia. Winds gusted fiercely, snow swirled through the darkness, and visibility fell to dangerously low levels. Runway conditions were poor, coated with a layer of snow and ice. Controllers at Halifax knew the situation was challenging, but operations continued, as they so often do in Canada, where winter weather is a constant companion. As the Airbus approached, the crew discussed the conditions. Crosswinds were strong, but within limits. Landing was possible, but it would require skill and precision. The alternative diverting was an option, but with passengers eager to arrive and fuel considerations pressing, the pilots opted to continue. At approximately 12:43 a.m., the aircraft descended through clouds and blowing snow. Passengers peered out their windows, but saw nothing but darkness and streaks of white. Inside the cockpit, the pilots searched for the runway lights, knowing that at any moment they would need to commit fully to the landing or go around. Then, suddenly, there was a jolt. Instead of touching down on the designated landing zone, the Airbus struck power lines just short of the runway threshold. The impact severed the aircraft's electrical power and ripped off parts of the landing gear. Seconds later, the jet slammed onto the runway surface with tremendous force, skidding violently as sparks flew and snow blasted against the fuselage. The A320 continued to slide, unable to stop within the snowy, icy distance. It finally came to rest more than 1,000 feet beyond the runway. Its nose battered, its landing gear collapsed, and its fuselage scarred. Incredibly, the aircraft remained largely intact, sparing those on board from a fiery end. Inside the cabin, chaos erupted. Overhead, bins burst open, lights flickered out, and passengers screamed as they braced for impact after impact. When the jet finally stopped, there was silence for a brief moment, then a rush of voices, cries for help, and the urgent commands of flight attendants. Emergency slides were deployed into the freezing night. Passengers stumbled down into deep snow, shivering and disoriented, but alive. Miraculously, There were no fatalities. 25 people were injured, some seriously, but every soul on board survived. For many, stepping into the snow that night felt surreal, like walking out of a nightmare into another harsh reality. The wrecked Airbus loomed in the storm, its fuselage broken but not consumed by fire. Investigators later pieced together the chain of events. The aircraft had descended below the glide path during approach, touching down more than 1,000 feet short of the runway. Contributing factors included poor visibility, inadequate lighting, and the pilot's decision to continue rather than execute a go-around. The snowstorm reduced visual cues to almost nothing, and the crew misjudged their height above terrain. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada concluded that while the crew had been within operational limits, their approach was unstable. In hindsight, a diversion to another airport might have been the safer option. Yet the survival of everyone on board was also a testament to the strength of the Airbus design, the quick actions of the cabin crew, and the resilience of passengers who endured the terrifying ordeal. For Halifax, the incident highlighted the need for better runway lighting and clearer approach aids in winter conditions. Across Canada, airlines reinforced training about unstable approaches and the importance of go-arounds, even in the final moments before touchdown. For the passengers of Flight 834, however, the memories of that night remain vivid. The blinding snow, the sudden crashes, and the shocking realization that they had survived what could have been a major disaster. Many described it as walking away from death itself, a reminder that, in aviation, fortune and misfortune often balance on the edge of a single decision. Runways are meant to be safe places, the bridges between the ground and the sky. Yet as history has shown, they can also be the stage for aviation's most devastating tragedies. From Tenerife in 1977, where two Boeing 747 seconds collided in the fog, to Milan's Linate in 2001, where a business jet strayed into the path of a departing airliner, to Madrid in 2008, where a single forgotten checklist item cost more than 150 lives. The stories we have revisited reveal how fragile safety can be when precision falters. Each of these disasters carried its own unique circumstances: fog, miscommunication, poor signage, outdated technology, or human error. Yet together they paint a clear picture. In aviation, there are no small mistakes. A single misheard instruction, a missing warning tone, or a moment of hesitation can set off a chain reaction that ends in catastrophe. But history is not only about tragedy, it is also about progress. After Tenerife, the world adopted standardized radio phraseology and crew resource management. After Linate, airports across Europe invested in advanced ground radar, clearer taxiway signage, and stricter visibility protocols. After Madrid, airlines doubled down on checklist discipline, and older warning systems were scrutinized and modernized. Even the near misses the overruns in Bangkok and Halifax, or the excursions at Matsuyama, served as powerful reminders that complacency has no place in aviation. These events pushed regulators to expand runway and safety areas, improve lighting, and ensure that pilots understood that a go-around is never a sign of weakness, but a commitment to safety. Today, millions of flights take off and land every year without incident. Pilots, controllers, and engineers operate in a system that is safer than ever before, shaped by the painful lessons of the past. Yet as these stories show, safety is not automatic. It must be earned every single day, with every single flight. For the families who lost loved ones, these improvements cannot erase the pain. Their grief is the unspoken cost behind every new regulation, every new system, every better designed taxiway and runway. Aviation owes its safety record to those who never came home. And so, as we leave these stories behind, we remember not only the tragedies, but the resilience that followed. Each accident, each overrun, each collision is a reminder that the pursuit of safety never ends. For those who board an airplane today, the legacy of Tenerife, Linate, Detroit, Madrid, and Halifax lives on in every safe landing, every clear instruction, every flight that arrives without incident. If you found this journey through aviation history meaningful, don't forget to subscribe. Your support allows us to continue telling the stories that shape the skies we fly in today.